Hello and welcome. We're back again for another episode of Yoga Props. Why would we use them? Today I'd like to talk to you about bolsters and blankets. Bolsters are mainly used in restorative, but not always. They can be very supportive for the body in all kinds of ways. And blankets are very, very versatile, and if you don't have a bolster, often a blanket can take its place. So to get started, I'll move this mountain out of the way. And we'll start with the blanket. So any kind of blanket you have is fine. I like to have a thinner kind of, sometimes they're called Shavasana blankets, or it might be a silk blanket. You can do a thin fleece blanket. Those are nice to fold up into squares. You can also have something a bit heavier, a cotton blanket, maybe one from Mexico or from India. Those work really well too. So with the small blanket, how do we use it? We can use it if we don't have a block for sitting on to elevate the hips. It's nice and soft. You can also use your thicker blanket as well. Blankets are nice if our hamstrings are tight and we want to have a little elevation, but again, we don't have a bolster. So you have to play around with the folding of your blanket, and you can make your blanket into a bolster. Roll it up, I call it a sushi roll. And then we can tuck the blanket underneath the knees. So maybe we're sitting in Dandasana and our knees need to be bent, so we have that nice support for the knees. We can also use it when we are lying down. Take your other small blanket to tuck underneath your head. Feels great, nicely supported. We can also use a roll. Now this roll might be a little too high, so I'll switch back to my smaller blanket. And if your blanket has any tassels, roll them to the inside so they're not poking into you. And make a nice tight roll. You can also use a towel. And what we're going to do is use this roll to help open up 3 points in the spine. We're going to work in the upper back, right behind the heart center. We're going to work in the mid back, so kind of mid rib cage, and then into the lower back. So to start, you're going to take your roll, place it on your mat, and you want to lay down so the roll is kind of in line with the armpits. And when you lie down, you feel a lift in your chest. So we would hang out here for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we would move the roll down just a couple inches. You can play around with it, but you want to feel that lift right in your solar plexus. So it's a part of the spine that typically does not open back, so it might feel a little odd. And again, we stay here for 2 or 3 minutes. And then their last position, we'll wiggle down, let the roll sit right in the curve of your lower back. And that can often provide a whole lot of relief. And again, 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. What feels good for you? When we're finished, we slide the roll out. We can also use the roll to help with the length of the spine. So instead of opening the way we were this way, we can open this way. And it'll make more sense when I show you. So you can take your roll, place it down lengthwise on your mat, and you might need a longer blanket or a shorter blanket depending on your length, but I want to have that roll right down parallel with my spine. So now I'm getting a long opening through the back. And it feels pretty darn good. Of course, the other thing that the blanket is really good for is Shavasana. So I will unfold my blanket. And it's the end of the class, and I've had a great practice, and now I'm really looking forward to the rest. So I can use my other blanket as a support underneath my head. I'm covered up and lie down. And if you're missing an eye pillow, but you would like to have your eyes covered, you can take that extra length in your blanket and put it over the eyes. And then stay here for as long as you like. So that's the blanket in a nutshell. Very versatile. You can play around and figure out how it works best for you. One thing I did forget to mention is if your knees need support, can't forget those knees. I get caught up in the excitement of Shavasana. So if you're sitting cross-legged and maybe one hip isn't feeling quite right or the knee's a little sore, fold up your blanket as high as you need, tuck it underneath so your knee has somewhere to land and it feels much, much better. And sticking with the support of the knees, you can kind of unfold it into a long rectangle so that when you come into a tabletop, you can put it underneath your knees for support, or when you're in a lunge, very helpful. So that's the blanket. We'll put that over to the side. And we'll move on to maybe what we could call the blanket's big brother, the bolster. So I have three kinds of bolsters. I have this skinny bolster. I think it's about 26 inches long. I have kind of a fatter rectangular bolster. And then I have this hefty round bolster. And they all have different purposes and they can all be quite wonderful. So let's start with the round bolster. So the round bolster is high, they're usually quite dense, and the most obvious place to use this is underneath your knees. So instead of using the blanket, now we have the bolster. So these nice smooth edges which fit perfectly. It was like it was designed to sit underneath your knees. And then of course I'm laying down, so I'd like to tuck something underneath my head. And then of course, if you really want to settle in, find another blanket and cover yourself up and hang out here for a while. It feels pretty good. When you're ready to come out, it's nice to just roll that bolster away, roll over, and help yourself up to seated. We can also use our bolster to assist in child's pose, either a day we need extra support or a time when we really want extra support if we're doing something more restorative. So this time the bolster goes long, the knees go wide, and we allow the body to drape, hanging out over the bolster. So the bolster is really supporting me. It's taking all my weight, and it really feels quite lovely. If you don't have a round bolster for your child's pose, you could also use your square bolster. Now it's not as high, so if you find when you come down it's a little more of a struggle, then you can double up with your blanket. So give that a nice fat fold, just to build up a little height. You kind of get the idea. And then allow the body to sink forward. Now another thing we can use our blanket for is when we're coming into that child's pose, if we're finding that this crease in the hip, it's a little tight and we don't like all that compression, what's really nice to do is to take your blanket and have the soft folded edge, tuck it right into your hip crease and move the excess out of the way so that when you fold forward, it decreases the amount of compression. And that feels pretty good. Another thing we can do with our square bolster, the more props you use, the more they get in the way, is to again help with opening up the spine. So whereas we had rolled up our blanket, that long skinny sushi roll to be along the length of the spine, we can use our big fat bolster for that. So when you do this, you can either have your sacrum scooched right up to the bolster, or maybe you walk forward a little bit and put about a fist width distance between your sacrum and the bolster. Probably want a blanket for your head, and I'll show you why. So I roll back, settle my seat down, I want to make sure my chin is tucked in and my ribs have dropped. I'm a bit of a rib thruster, so if I don't have something under my head, my chin pops up and you can see my ribs have kind of jumped up. So when I use something under my head, my neck is nice and long, my chin is in, and my ribs are not so flared. And if I wanted to get really fancy, take your round bolster, tuck it under your knees, and that's about as good as it gets right now. That feels fantastic. But eventually, all good things must come to an end for the time being. So we make our way out, move the bolsters out of the way. We can also use this square bolster under the knees if we don't have a round bolster or our blanket just doesn't feel adequate. However, because it's wide, it's not always the most comfortable thing to have under the legs, so you can play around and just see how that feels. It's a little different. What some people do is they flip it up so it's taller, and this is nice if you have longer legs. So now the back of my thighs has something to rest on. And again, tuck the blanket under your head, cover yourself up. Really nice. You can also just push that bolster down. When you're stretched out long, rest your heels. So a little elevation of the legs. So it's a really, really slight incline. And we gently make our way out. So our other bolster, this one is kind of my favorite, this skinny bolster. I find it much more versatile and a lot easier to carry. It's way lighter than the round one or the big rectangle one, and we can use it pretty much in the same way. It's nice to have under the knees. And one thing I didn't mention with the other two bolsters, you can also use a bolster to support your knees when you're in a reclined butterfly. You can also use blocks, but a bolster is much softer. You can also use the bolster like we did our sushi roll. So it comes along on your mat. And this is going to be a little different experience. It's a little firmer and it's less wide. So when we lay back, now my shoulders are opening around the bolster. And again, grab your blanket as you need. And you can feel the heart opening. And it's a really lovely place to be. A couple other ways we can use a bolster, and this is when I like the skinny bolsters for a yin practice. So in yin, we're very much ragdoll. We want to let those muscles go, but sometimes our head needs a little extra supporting. So when you're in a caterpillar, which is our straight leg forward fold, and I let everything relax and my spine gets all slouchy, it's the one practice where you're allowed to slouch. Maybe when I'm folding forward, and my head is hanging down, this is just too much pressure on my neck today. What I can do is use my bolster, just gently anchoring it between my legs, have it on an angle and allow my forehead to rest. So I still get the softness in the spine and the slouch in the shoulder, but my head is supported. You can also use it across the body. So you can be very creative. And one thing I almost forgot is pigeon pose. And there's many ways to do a pigeon pose, and for a lot of people, pigeon is challenging on the knees or it just doesn't quite work in the hip. So a traditional pigeon looks something like this. I have my right leg bent in front of me and my left leg is walked out long. And so I'm getting a really big stretch on this side of my hip. Now, if I'm feeling a little wobbly or I need a little extra support, you could grab your blanket or your bolster, tuck it underneath your hip. So I have somewhere again to land. Takes a little bit of the pressure off. I can add my bolster. So I'm still getting the stretch, but I'm not sinking all the way down to the floor. I can change the angle, and maybe I let my torso rest. And this feels pretty fantastic. Again, a couple other options. We'll take that blanket away. Come out of the pose. This one's a little tricky to get in, but often feels quite awesome when we're there. Step your leg over the bolster. So we want to have support for the thigh. I'm going to walk that left leg over to the right and settle myself down. So now the back of my left thigh is on the bolster, my knee is bent. My right leg's at a funny angle, but that will change. I'm going to roll, square up my hips, and probably just hang out here. This feels pretty good. If I have another bolster, I could build it up underneath me. I could use a stack of blankets. Hanging out feels pretty awesome. Just come out, you just kind of drop over, move your leg. You could also try it with your skinny bolster if you find this one is too wide. In restorative, bolsters are our best friend. So a really nice side opening stretch with a bolster. The skinny bolster is probably a bit too narrow, but it depends again on the side of the body. What we want is this bolster to fit in the rib cage. So I have the bolster across my mat. I scooch myself up so the side of my thigh is against the bolster, and I lift myself up and over. So it's a supported side bend. And if you don't like your head plop down on the ground, grab a blanket, build yourself up. So there's really no weight on this bottom arm, and I might rest however feels good for my arm and stay here for a while. And one last thing I'll show you that bolsters or even a blanket is really handy for is a twist, a reclined twist. So I'm going to have my blanket and my bolster. I'm going to come down onto my back. When I bring my knees over to the side, this is a lot of drag. I'm feeling a lot of pull in the side of my leg, and it's just, oh, it's really not very comfortable. So I want twist to be a benefit. So I'm going to take my bolster, bring it over, and allow my bottom leg to land on it so my top leg has less distance to go. And that might be enough, but maybe I need a little bit more. I can take my blanket and tuck it in between my knees. That feels pretty good. Or maybe my legs come down, but something's not quite right. I don't need the support under here. I need the support in between. And when I do that, it gives my leg a place to land, and I can settle into that twist and just ring out the day, and things feel really good. And then coming back up to seated. In a pinch, you can also use your bolster instead of your blanket or a block to sit on. So my hips are nice and high, my knees come towards the earth. And one last thing I'll show you is kneeling. Not everybody's favorite. It's not always kind to everyone's knees. So you can pick the size of bolster. You can also use a blanket. Tuck it in between and sit yourself back. So there's way less stress on the tops of the feet. My knees aren't bent quite so high. And it's all right. All is good with the world. So that's just a short little tour of what you can do with your bolsters. I encourage you always to experiment. If the body's not feeling like it's really settling into a pose, grab a blanket, roll it up, stuff it up, tuck it underneath a part that feels like it's floating or needs a little extra support. I always say you can never have too many props when you're practicing yoga, because we want to make sure the body feels comfortable and supported. So I hope you found this video helpful. Again, like I said, practice, play around, and see how it goes.